Comenzando este coloquio sobre filosofía, psicología y psicoanálisis. Tenemos la fortuna de tener al doctor Robert Pippin aquí, de la Universidad de Chicago. Vamos a operar de esta manera. Él nos va a dar su conferencia, después vamos a hablar de realmente el motivo de este coloquio, que es la presentación de la traducción en español de su libro Nietzsche, la psicología y la filosofía primera. Entonces, bueno, vamos a estar hablando un poco los presentadores de este libro, y al final de toda esta sesión abrimos preguntas para el público, participaciones, en fin. Pero bueno, muchas gracias por haber venido. Voy a presentar al doctor Robert Pippin. Él es experto en la tradición de filosofía alemana, concentrándose en Kant y Hegel. Ha publicado diversos textos sobre filosofía y psicología, filosofía política, teorías de la autoconciencia y el problema de la libertad. Su lista de libros es tremenda, ¿no? Para mencionar solo algunos, mencioné la teoría de la forma de Kant, por supuesto, Nietzsche, la psicología y la filosofía primera, también sobre el western americano, los westerns de Hollywood y el mito americano, y en fin, una larga lista de publicaciones. Él nos va a hablar precisamente de este libro, entonces le cedo la palabra ya sin más.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be in Mexico City again, and I'm especially grateful to Professor Lazo Briones for the translation of my book. You can't see the cover very well now, but if it is what I think it is, it's an extremely clever cover. It's a very close-up photograph of the eye of an animal. And to me it looks like the eye of an owl, which means it's a reference to Hegel's famous claim about the owl of Minerva, the symbol of wisdom, which Hegel says takes flight only at dusk, when a historical period is over. But if the eye represents the eye of the owl of Minerva, what's extremely clever about the cover is that you see in the corner of the eye a fly, tiny fly, something dirty, impure, unclean, that disturbs the vision of the eye. It's a perfect cover for Nietzsche, and a challenge to the hyper-rationalist Hegel. So I'm very, very pleased with the cover, and of course very grateful to Pablo for the translation, and to all of you for being here, for allowing me to speak in my native language, although were I to try to speak your beautiful language, it would be very painful for you. I'm glad we've come up with this solution. I have a little bit of a guilty conscience about this particular paper. In my book, I'm trying to argue that the main strands of the Nietzsche reception in philosophy have very badly distorted what Nietzsche was trying to do. One strand is the Anglo-American attempt to turn Nietzsche into a conventional philosopher, so that we hear his views on epistemology, metaphysics, value theory, as if he were simply proposing assertions and offering unusual arguments for them. The other strand is the European reception, mostly influenced by Heidegger, which treats Nietzsche as the last metaphysician of the West, as a metaphysician of the will to power. That also seems to me to distort the uniqueness of Nietzsche in the philosophical tradition by associating him with more conventional treatments on either side of the divide in philosophy in the West that happened after Hegel. So in the book, I really pay a great deal of attention to the unusual literary style of Nietzsche, and I concentrate on three very famous images. One, the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, that truth is a woman, and that philosophers are very clumsy lovers. Secondly, first in the gay science, the very famous claim by Ayatollah Nietzsche, a crazy man, that God is dead, and that we have killed him. And third, from the genealogy of morals, the claim that just as there is no lightning behind the lightning flash, there is no subject behind a human deed. The doer is in the deed. Now, in the Anglophone reaction to my book, because of the latter theme on the nature of a deed or an action, makes so many connections with conventional philosophy of action, a lot of the responses to the book have been about that claim, more than about the general claim about Nietzsche or the other two parts. So this paper is a response to a few criticisms of that, the implications I draw from that claim. But the paper is going to make it sound like I think I am one of the people I'm criticizing. The conventional readers of Nietzsche as offering a philosophical theory. I don't think Nietzsche offers a philosophical theory. I think Nietzsche's philosophy is not doctrinal. I think Plato's philosophy is not doctrinal. It's about something else than substantive doctrine. But I needed to respond to these critics, and hence the form of this paper. In my 2011 book, Nietzsche, Psychology, First Philosophy, I argued for, among other things, the importance of the French moralists for any attempt to understand why Nietzsche should have said in Beyond Good and Evil that psychology now, that is because of him, because of Nietzsche, can once again become the queen of the sciences, and once more the path to the fundamental problems. Among other things, this led to a characterization of Nietzsche on human agency that could be called expressivist, and my intention in this paper is to clarify that in more detail. My purpose in invoking the tradition of Pascal, de Rochefoucauld, and above all Montaigne, aside from the fact of Nietzsche's frequent praise of that tradition and identification of himself with it has largely gone unnoticed, was twofold. First, this book is based on earlier lectures that were originally given in a cours at the Collège de France in 2004. And anyone who knows anything about 20th century French philosophy, and especially French appropriations of Nietzsche, will know of the enormous influence of Heidegger on that tradition. My somewhat ironic intention was to remind my audience, my French audience, that from the point of view of Nietzsche, he is unquestionably better understood as a French moralist rather than the German metaphysician of Heidegger's influential lectures from the 1930s and the 1940s. But this historical association raises the philosophical question. Granted, one might concede, Nietzsche very greatly admired these people, especially Montaigne, and described what he was doing as psychology in a way that called them to mind, but what does that tell us? What viewed in this way is a philosophically relevant psychology? This is a question the book tries to answer from a number of different perspectives, but the core issue is the one that chiefly interested Nietzsche, the problem of self-knowledge, and the relation between that problem and knowledge of others' actions and words, and especially the unique kind of difficulty one faces in attempting to know such things as why one, or anyone, did what one did, what it actually was that one or anyone did, what one or some other truly values, why one values what one does, how one could come to know what sort of life one might truly affirm, and if so, how. It's clear everywhere in the text that Nietzsche did not think that this question could be answered by any manner of introspection, inner observation of any kind, anything like a natural science. And such self-knowledge is certainly not to be had by a priori philosophizing about the basic structure of the human soul, as in Plato's theory of the tripartite soul. It would at least be fair to say that the most prominent Nietzschean characterization of any claim to self and other knowledge is that it is extremely difficult to arrive at such knowledge, partly because it is neither empirical nor a priori knowledge in the conventional sense, partly because the soul is not an object in the usual sense, but mostly because in his treatments, such putative self and other knowledge is almost always an expression of some self-deception that must be overcome. This is not to say that there's no such thing as self or other knowledge properly understood, but to suggest that the truth in such a realm does not have as its opposite falsity in the propositional sense, but a kind of fraudulence in what one reports about oneself or claims about another person. Understanding this, the moralists, for Nietzsche, offered observations on the sort of questions posed above, not by relying on a general theory that provided instances, but by finding ways to characterize how the human soul typically works in ways true to the unstable, variable, situation-dependent, self-interested context in which they arise. There is no way to summarize the method they use to do this because there is no such method, any more than there is any method that can be invoked to show how something like, quote, I knew not only that she was lying, but that she knew I knew she was lying, and she didn't care. We do know those things. And saying that we know them by inference from cues, say, gets us nowhere. One might as well ask what method Shakespeare, another of Nietzsche's heroes, used in coming to understand human beings like Macbeth or Othello, or ambition or jealousy so well. Here is a summary of the dangers of a philosophical psychology that, I argued in the book, should be adopted as some sort of publication hurdle. That is, if I were king, no one could publish a book on Nietzsche unless they could argue it would be consistent with the remarks in assorted opinions and maxims from human all to human. Nietzsche is describing what he calls the, quote-unquote, original sin of all philosophers, who, he says, have always appropriated and ruined the views of the Menschenprüfer, the evaluators of the human, the moralists, because, quote, they have taken them for unqualified propositions and sought to demonstrate the absolute validity of what these moralists intended merely as approximate signposts, or even as no more than truths possessing tendency only for a decade, and through doing so to elevate themselves above the ladder. The example of such original sin he gives is Schopenhauer on the will. Nietzsche claims that Schopenhauer was in reality, without appreciating the fact himself, a moralist, who rightly used the term will loosely, and in a way that referred broadly to a meaning common to many different human situations, and as Nietzsche says, merely filled the gap in language. And so Schopenhauer had earned the right, quote, to speak of the will as Pascal had spoken of it. Unfortunately, though, quote, the philosophical rage for universality, unquote, turned such a moraliste façon de parler into a metaphysical claim about the omnipresence of the will in all of nature, a claim some, like Heidegger, have attributed to Nietzsche, but that Nietzsche calls a piece of mystical mischief, mystische Unfüge, and so ended up turning everything, Nietzsche says, into a false reification, to eine falsche Verdinglichung. Hence the general approach of the book. Now I come to the famous passage that's provoked a lot of criticism in my critics. It comes from Genealogy of Morals, section 1, passage 13, and here it is. To demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs, is just as absurd to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. The quantum of force is equivalent to a quantum of drive, will, effect, more. It is nothing other than precisely this very driving, willing, effecting, and only owing to the seduction of language and of the fundamental errors of reason that are petrified in it, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, by a subject, that it can appear otherwise. For just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash, and takes the latter for an action, for the operation of a subject called lightning, so popular morality also separates strength from expressions of strength, as if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Das Tun ist alles. Unquote. The passage is highly literary, enigmatic, and not at all systematic. However fascinating, it does not give us a lot to work with, and much of the interpretive task consists in determining what Nietzsche could have meant, given what else he says about psychological explanation. The idea that Nietzsche is indirectly proposing here, that the doer is expressed in the deed, and in that sense is not behind it as a separate cause, opens the door to very large issues prominent in Spinoza on a substance's non-temporal expression in its attributes and modes, and similar issues in everyone from Leibniz to Schelling to Jacob Berman, as Deleuze has argued. But more directly, and from the outset, one might entertain immediate doubts that, to explain the passage, we have to commit Nietzsche to that different relation between doer and deed, than an ex-ante causal origin, with the deed as a result. Why not, as the passage seems to suggest, that there's no relation at all between a doer and a deed because there is no doer? Admittedly, the most startling formulation in this passage is an analogy. Just as there is no lightning behind and causing as a result the flash, as might be suggested by the sentence, the lightning flash, so there is no doer behind the deed, as might be suggested by John hit the ball. Such a substratum is a fiction added on. The deed is all there is. Everything, always. As if we should really say, I suppose, there are just ball-hitting events going on. As noted, I argue that this passage should be understood differently, as a sketch of an expressivist theory of action one can find throughout Nietzsche. That is, that he remains committed to the distinction between action and event, and is proposing a way to make the distinction different from voluntarism, spontaneity theories, intention causal theories, and so forth. That difference involves noticing that Nietzsche is only denying that there is a doer behind and separate from the deed. The language of doer-deed is not dropped. A strong person's strength is expressed in a desire to overcome in other things. In a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, a thirst for enemies and resistances and triumphs. The various bodily movements involved in each of these activities would be unintelligible. Mere bodily movements in space and time, were we not able to understand them in their psychological meaning as expressions of strength, as motivated by a strength that wants expressing. If deeds are reduced to mere bodily movements like natural events, we won't have any way of distinguishing identical body movements that are directly motivated and so are different deeds. There would be many such problems. However, the no substratum, nothing behind the deed language, prohibits us from thinking of psychological motives, or even their neurobiological counterparts, as causes of separate deeds. And we must keep this in mind when Nietzsche gives his own psychological explanations, and I wouldn't know how to characterize those explanations except as psychological, the famous ones of pity, of humility, of the desire for equality, for the slave revolt in morality, and so forth. These are not just events that happen. They are psychologically motivated. But then we need to explain what he means by saying there's no doer behind the deed, but in the deed. Hence my suggestion that Nietzsche is trying to get us to see the doer in the deed rather than behind it. And the point of that is to deflate our reliance on our own ex-ante formulations of intention to account for what happens. Such formulations, when necessary, again, there wouldn't be deeds unless such mindedness could be attended to as such, are only provisional. are realized or not only in the deed that reveals what in fact we are committed to doing, what we really intended. Nietzsche does not go any further in the passage or elsewhere, so as noted, the task in filling out such a view in a way consistent with other things Nietzsche says, like the Schopenhauer moralist passage just quoted, or his own psychological explanations, is different. This is admittedly a complicated thought. It does not mean, as it might seem to, that in doing something, I discover some ex ante determinate intention that caused the deed without my being aware of it. So the door is not open to a psychoanalytic explanation either. Nietzsche's insistence that the doer is wholly in the deed must mean that what I am willing to do, let us say, arises as the mindedness relevant to the deed as I actually act, and only then. Again, the model is something like an artist discovering what she wants only in the writing or painting. I have an example in the book that makes this point Nietzsche is making. There are, by most accounts, among educated Americans, 50 or 60% who consider themselves poets. Very large number of people. And they often imagine one of these people, to make this point about Nietzsche, having an idea for a poem, and then trying to write what the person thinks is the intention behind the writing, and the poem is written, and the person realizes it's a bad poem. And so, say, she says to herself, well, that's not the true expression of what I intended. What I have in me is a good poem. I just haven't found the right mode of expression. The point I'm making in Nietzsche's name is, no, what you wrote is the bad poem that you had in mind. You're only able to write bad poems. You don't have a lot of good poems inside you that can't get out. So I'm saying Nietzsche is not denying that there's some provisional intention and some outward manifestation, but it's only in the outward manifestation that it can become clearer to you what you were committed to doing. So the premise governing all of this is that Nietzsche takes far, far more seriously than most philosophers that we are profoundly unknown to ourselves. Most of what we tell ourselves about our motivations, commitments, intentions is very likely false. And we only learn it's false if we learn it when we're called on to do something that turns out to be inconsistent with what we avow, pledge. I would never do that, we say, in criticizing someone else. And how often is it the case that when we face a similar situation, we do? There would be no films by Claude Chabrol, for example, if there were not such unknowingness in the minds of conventional characters. Now, I should say there's a perfectly ordinary sense in which we want to call the intention that explains what the deed is and why it was done simply what the agent had in mind to do, ex ante, before the fact. Nietzsche is not denying that. Sometimes this intention is implicit and unformulated, but it's easily available at any point if I am asked what I am doing and why. Why are you here, for example? Possible to give an answer that is some articulation of what you provisionally intended before you came. But again, in Nietzsche's world, it's very likely false, which we would only learn were you tested by having that intention require you to do something else that would establish, say, something more difficult. We can certainly imagine this mental state occurring sometime before the bodily movement begins, and so can say easily that such an intention and the agent who holds it can be understood as before and behind the deed that is eventually performed. Likewise, there's nothing in what Nietzsche is suggesting to imply that there are not conditions that have to be met for the deed to qualify as mine alone. I have to be able to exercise some control over the event, not be coerced or duped and manipulated. I see no Nietzschean reason to deny that persons can come to understand themselves this way and can attempt to live out the implications of a self-image. It's the correct analysis of this way of speaking that's at issue. So Nietzsche's account need not deny that there are such ex ante, before the fact, formulations, as if they couldn't exist. His model just holds them to be provisional, most often in ordinary doings, perhaps very simple doings, actually and unproblematically manifested in the deed, but it's only there that the provisional becomes actual. They are realized, made real in what we are willing to do. And they need to be considered provisional because in a surprisingly large number of significant cases, what we are willing to avow as our intention is a fantasy, largely self-deluded and not consistent with what we do. In the passage, in other words, Nietzsche still refers to deeds, doings, and not events, things that happen. And with that, as far as I can see, the question of how and why the deed was produced, and with that, the problem of the doer is unavoidably raised. So I presume that everyone would agree that Nietzsche shows no tendency to treat a plant's phototropism, or iron or rusting, as explicable in the same way as human activities. There is perhaps some analogous or metaphorical way to say that the plant's turning toward the sun expresses its need for light, but there is nothing in that that refers to the plant's view of what it needs and why, nothing psychological. As indicated in the examples, Nietzsche's explanation of such things as the slave revolt, pity, humility, egalitarianism, a reference to the mindedness inherent in such activities, is essential to their individuation and explanation. If we simply try to do justice to the fact that Nietzsche's explanation of such phenomena are everywhere psychological, an attempt to determine what mindedness is really expressed in the deed, the issue of how he understands the relation between the deed's mindedness and the deed is unavoidable. He rejects behind and before, and I suggested he is thinking of in, and as a process of realization. Things get complicated quickly because Nietzsche is so suspicious of the avowed self-ascribed motivations provided by agents, but he always suggests as what truly motivates other psychological phenomena like ressentiment or fear or self-hatred. And although in this passage Nietzsche suggests that strength cannot but express itself as strength, that claim must be made consistent with the variety of things he says about such disposition. There is the issue of what counts as the expression of strength. Much easier to say in the case of birds of prey than human expressions. For example, what Nietzsche calls the ascetic, life-denying ascetic, might regard his activities, refraining from expressions of strength, as the highest manifestation of strength. Then there are contexts in which strength is not allowed its expression, and the strong, to use his words, can be said to rub themselves raw on the bars of self-imposed cages. There is strength that can be said to turn against itself as strength. Distinguishing any of these will require the depth psychology Nietzsche is proposing. Still, one might say, while agreeing that Nietzsche does not tie any notion of individual responsibility to a spontaneous causal power to initiate bodily movements, any continuing to talk of a doer, even in the deed, betrays a lingering reluctance to break more completely with the essentially moral notions of individual responsibility, agent, and accountability, a truly revolutionary break many suspect may be the sort Nietzsche intended. But it's not clear where such a radical break would land us. I made use of Nietzsche's invocation of Spinoza to show why for him agent regret, people feeling bad that they did something, that it was on them that they did it, their fault. Nietzsche preserves such agent regret, but it's not regret that I could have done otherwise, but sadness that I turned out not to be other than I had imagined. Just a suggestion requires more filling out, but any such exposition must be consistent with the fact that first, Nietzsche does want some account of agent regret. That's why he turned to Spinoza, from whom he gets this understanding of sadness. And second, so the idea here is you did something you were ashamed of. You lied to a friend to achieve a benefit for yourself. And you feel a great regret that you did that later. And the regret is, I shouldn't normally express, I shouldn't have done that. I could have avoided doing that. The Spinoza Nietzsche analysis is, no, you couldn't have avoided doing it. That's who you are. What you feel is sadness that you turned out to be the kind of person who would lie to a friend for self-benefit. And secondly, all of Nietzsche's rhetoric, as you all know, is everywhere hortatory and condemnatory. In some sense or other, he expects, or at least hopes, that we can overcome nihilism largely by listening to, being gripped by him. A transformation that may produce what we are now not, what he calls sovereign individuals. All these notions continue and deepen the question of the right understanding between an agent and her deeds. It does not avoid or dismiss the question as if there is no such distinction. At this point, there are several things to say about the expressivist. The deed expresses the doer in the deed. Let us say of inner and outer. And first of all, failed actions. These are the sorts of cases that are often raised as objections to me and to Nietzsche. So if what you are is only fully expressed in the deed, what about deeds that really, because of contingencies, don't have any real connection with anything ex ante? Someone, let's call him Lanier, did everything he could to arrive on time for Joshua's party, but some intervening contingency prevented him. Traffic, for example. But surely he intended to arrive on time. Must an expressivist account say otherwise? Since he arrived late, he must have been intending to arrive late? No. Lanier took several outer steps towards the outer realization of his intention. He left early, checked the traffic, drove moderately so he wouldn't get in a wreck. There's plenty of evidence from other actions that he's always polite and conscientious about such things, and that he values Joshua's friendship. And there is no way he could have gotten himself stuck in the traffic jam. That happened to him. He was well on the way, and there's plenty of outer manifesting his inner, even if not completely. Now notice that the situation would change if we imagine Lanier's wife saying, "Why do you always drive this way to go to Joshua's? You know it always makes us late, and you know there's a better way." That would change everything. Or if we imagine Lanier at home saying, "There's plenty of time to get there, but I always have bad luck with traffic, so I might as well not even go, since I'll arrive so late. But at least I intended to go, until I remembered this." No, you didn't intend to go. Moreover, the fact that the doer must be understood to express in the deed need not entail that everything in the agent's ex ante mindedness must be expressed for the movement to count as a deed, that the doer is wholly identified with the deed in that sense. There can be degrees of expression that can be authentic expressions, or that expression alone warrants the agent's affirmation of the deed, just if it's even a partial one. On the former issue, the position I want to attribute to Nietzsche is not wholly indifferent to contingencies. So take my poetry example and consider the case of a sculpture. I begin to sculpt, and a small, insignificant chisel mark cracks the entire stone into pieces. One should not say that I must have intended this pile of rubble, that I must be identified with what happens. That is the key. Something happened. Something that was not a deed. Could have been an expression of any aspect of my mindedness. Again, the situation changes if we imagine someone warning our sculpture, "You know, you take too many risks always chiseling like that. So many of your marbles crack. You seem to want them to crack." So, on my account, the relation between doer and deed is some form of identity. Something can count as a deed, even if not the deed I self-deceptively and self-servingly insist it is. The deed can be mine, even if a lot remains undetermined for me and others about what I actually intended by doing it. It could be very unclear. We might have to wait and see what else I am willing to do in order to be more determinative. There can be a great deal of interpretive play and so indeterminacy for me and others in the question, what is it that I have done and why? There can be a lot of imprecision in trying to draw a line between what happens because of me, but is not something I did, and what I did. On the latter issue, the expression-affirmation issue, there are clearly two senses at work of the deed being mine. The first might be called a merely forensic sense, an answer to the question, whose deed is this? This deed was brought about, but by whom? This is the sense in which the law wants to know whose deed, whose murder. The butlers, the mistresses, who killed Colonel Mustard in the dining room. Then there's another sense, much more difficult to answer, and this turns on the very elusive issue of the Nietzschean theory of freedom. Nietzsche was obviously concerned that the power of modern conformism would render any expression of anyone's mindedness some sort of distortion, and so some sort of social pathology, even if authentic. But a distortion, no, anyway, the idea here is that even if your deed does reflect perfectly some avowed intention that you begin with, the forces that led to the formation of this intention in you are so external to you and manipulate you to such an extent for the sake of someone else that even though you act freely, in the sense that no one coerces you to act that way, you feel no imminent threat. Because of the formation of the intention in a situation of such conformism, the deed can still not count as yours. But a distortion of what? Of what the agent would have intended had she not been subject to these conforming powers? Would have intended, if we imagine her free from the very beginning to be whoever she wants to be? That's clearly an idle fantasy for Nietzsche. No one could be in any such position. His own sense of genuinely or authentically mine is extremely difficult, and it is a long-standing problem in the history of philosophy. From the happy slaves issue to Rousseau and Kant, happy slaves meaning, suppose it's literally true that household slaves in the American South, when offered the chance to be free, chose to stay in the house as slaves. If you have a very limited conception of freedom, you would think, well, that settles the issue. They chose it. If you have a more complicated sense of what the conditions of choice are, you might not believe that. And I don't think that some notion of one struggling to overcome some obstacle in the outer will get us very far. That I'm struggling, striving, so it shows that I'm acting authentically. People can struggle very hard to express a canned and wholly inherited and manipulated sense of themselves. A few moments observing American politics can make that point. I think that all the evidence is that Nietzsche thought he knew how to make this distinction between mine in the merely forensic or factual sense, where that means simply not someone else's, and truly mine, all without having a true self ontology. But it did not make it easy for commentators, given what he said, to state the nature of this distinction, so there's still much to be done. Here's another component any psychological reading of Nietzsche must face. Bernard Williams praised Nietzsche's, as he called it, minimalist psychology. He was aligning himself with what he took to be Nietzsche's suspicions of accounts of the human soul that were already committed to some moral or ethical ideal, and then postulated the faculties or capacities necessary to make the pursuit of such ideals look possible and coherent. The divided, all the images in the history of philosophy, the divided soul, the free will, conscience, a moral sense, would all be examples of such a mistake. The relation, Nietzsche and Williams in effect argued, should go the other way. If we wanted to explain the possibility and coherence of the pursuit of such ideals, we ought to be constrained in doing so by an account of the capacities and faculties available in non-moral actions. Having introduced that notion, my aim was to associate it in its generality with the kinds of things the Platonic Socrates invokes eros, desire, to account for, from art to philosophy to love of good laws to friendship. The idea in such generality was first to notice the signal importance of what Nietzsche called esteem, schätzen, value. Nietzsche considers asserting a claim or recommending an action as expressions of some commitment to a value, something like promises to keep faith with and to be able to justify what was claimed, to remain committed to the implication of what was recommending. For Nietzsche, famously, these values are values because they are valued, not in themselves. Although that intimation of a projection of value misleadingly suggests individual acts of projection at punctuated moments of time conferring value. That's not the case. The claim is there would not be such values were humans not to have come to value them. But that process is complicated, collective, sustained over time, mediated in many institutional, religious, and artistic practices, and inherited. Very rarely, except in moments of crisis, open to revision. Nietzsche thinks we are living through such a potentially revolutionary time, comparable to the end of the tragic age of the Greeks. I went on to try to distinguish mere everyday commitments to various values, which are frequently subject to revision, expansion, abandonment, and by contrast, depth commitments, the loss of which would leave us nearly literally lost, disoriented, so they're almost impossible to imagine giving up. In undertaking these depth commitments, we are not fulfilling some other commitment, as if there could be a universal obligation to undertake depth commitments. That would obviously start an infinite regress. But there must be in our lives a hierarchical relation between thin, everyday, abandonable, and depth commitments. In making a claim or recommending an action, we commit ourselves to a variety of obligations that cannot all be fulfilled, and we need some orienting concern, some general sense of what is more or less important if we are to resolve these conflicts. We might say that the issue concerns what matters to us, which things matter because others do, and things that simply matter, that we cannot imagine not mattering. Now the interesting point. Since we do not and cannot decide what ought to matter, and thereby have it matter, even though we can do what we think ought to be significant to do, even without it actually mattering to us more than that. And as we all know, some things can matter to us that we are embarrassed about, that we think ought not to matter. We have to call such commitments, I think, what matters, pre-reflective and pre-volitional, or in another way, erotic attachments. We do not, for example, decide whom or what to love, whom or what to care about. It would be there are people who walk around and dating services now do this, in which you interact with your fellow human beings on the basis of a list of desirable qualities. And when you find somebody that fits the list, you might be able to convince yourself that you now, since they fit the list, love the person. That, of course, will be absurd. In our actions and say it doesn't happen very often. In our actions and inactions, we can be said to express what matters and what does not, and in our actions more reliably than what we avow. And in certain rare crisis moments, a depth commitment can be at stake, and the extent of such depth can be revealed. Now, this doesn't commit Nietzsche to any inner self. He's a well-known critic of that notion, as if you have a kind of core identity. For one thing, there's no assumption about such underlying permanent commitments or the bearers of such commitments. Things come to matter to someone in this critical way, and they can cease to matter suddenly, or matter in a different sense. The qualitative difference in the degree of the importance of a commitment and the role of that commitment in ordering one's actions need not entail any inner self ontology. Some critical deed may be critical because what is at stake is what matters the most, but only at that time, in that context. The spatial relation at issue is actually not rightly captured by notions like underlying or deep, but rather highest, and is in highest values. Now, I argued in the book that it was important to see things this way in order to understand that Nietzsche's diagnosis of our own time, the time of nihilism, was that it was not a crisis of credible belief, or, contrary to the common interpretations of Nietzsche, of strength of will, but the failure of desire, the failure of matter. This immediately gives the impression that the signal manifestation of this problem is failure in the sense of collapse, nothing mattering enough to be worth any investment or sacrifice. Boredom would be an example. This is, of course, a clear manifestation, and Nietzsche does appeal to the failure of desire in this sense with respect to the highest values. We don't care about anything highest. But there are lots of things that the people Nietzsche calls the last men, paradigmatic nihilists, care about. And they might even desire what they desire, however trivial, with passionate intensity. The even more paradoxical thought is that Nietzsche seems to think that one particularly catastrophic manifestation of nihilism in our age is contentment, bovine satisfaction in the low and base, caring about the wrong things, not caring. So clearly we need a more general sense of failure, more than just collapse or absence, if we are to understand nihilism as a failure of desire. We need something like certain pathological manifestations of desire, not its absence, can count as its failure, as in obsessive and so forever unsatisfiable desires, desires for unreasonable, unattainable objects, and an old standby in Nietzsche, self-deceived, self-destructive desires. One thought would be to pay attention to the fact that Nietzsche does not say that nihilism is the collapse of anything worth caring about, of all values. Nihilism is defined by the event the highest values devalue themselves. We might have lost the distinction between highest and lowest, might cease to care about it, to care only for what we happen to want. So the last men might care about all sorts of ends, but be without an ordering sense of the highest, that which matters most, worth sacrifice. And this disorientation is treated by Nietzsche as a kind of failure. They drift instead from pleasure to pleasure, timid, unwilling to take any risks for the sake of something worth taking risks for. This would count as a pathology if we can imagine such a life without begging any questions, as inevitably threatening some form of self-contempt, practical incoherence, conflicts that cannot be resolved, or as possible at all, without these effects, only by massive self-deceit. We could point to these self-defeating effects as a defense against the charge that we are inventing a capacity for depth commitment in order to defend an ethical ideal, contra Williams minimalism. I don't suggest that it's obvious that Nietzsche thinks this, but I want to propose that this is the answer suggested by many of Nietzsche's formulations. So very briefly, a final issue for the expressivist psychological interpretation. It's hard to understand the frequent Nietzschean emphasis on the value of self-overcoming, which he virtually equates with his understanding of freedom. And such remarks as in the genealogy, every good thing on earth eventually overcomes, destroys itself. Or later in the genealogy, when Nietzsche proclaims what he calls the law of life, the law of the necessity of self-overcoming in the nature of life, and to do justice to the appearance of this constantly, beständig, in remarks like, quote, how is freedom measured in individuals as in nations? By the resistance which has to be overcome, by the effort it causes to stay afloat. One would have to seek the highest type of free man where the greatest resistance is constantly being overcome. Does this emphasis in Nietzsche's praise of self-overcoming skew the interpretation in favor of some sort of priority of self-dissatisfaction, as if only such endlessly unsatisfied individuals were worthy of Nietzsche's praise? This is also a familiar idea in the modern tradition. Among the German Romantics in the beginning of the 19th century, especially in Friedrich von Schlegel, there arose the idea that irony is not merely a literary trope, a literary style, but an attitude to take with respect to the most important issues. The fundamental style of one's life should be ironic, committed and not committed at the same time. I think we all know people like that. Here I have to quote myself as a response to this, a summary of what the self-overcoming passages show. One initial, still quite crude summary of what he's getting at in these passages would simply be that achieved freedom involves achieving a capacity both to sustain a wholehearted commitment to an ideal and what appears at first glance to be a capacity in some tension with such wholeheartedness, a willingness to overcome or abandon such a commitment in altered circumstances or as a result of some development. To be unable to endure the irresolvable dynamic of what Nietzsche calls an ideals or a goals or a values constant self-overcoming, to remain dogmatically attached to an already overcome form of life, all these are treated as forms of unfreedom. Secondly, it is a consequence of this expressivism, that it counts what should be and is treated as, by Nietzsche, a rare and very difficult achievement, seeing oneself expressed in one's deeds in a wholehearted affirmation as a normal, everyday occurrence. Is that what I'm saying? No. As emphasized before, there are two separate questions that must be kept distinct. Expressivism is a claim that shares an assumption with all accounts of action as such, that there are bodily movements or mental happenings that stand in relation to a subject's mindedness. And it argues for a kind of relation different from all causal, compatibilist, voluntarist, free will accounts. Then there are all sorts of further questions one can ask about such expressed mindedness, including whether the deed actually or fully expresses what the agent avows, and whether the agent's mindedness can be said to really reflect her, or itself is the product of a coercive conformism. So to jump to another point, the people Nietzsche calls the weak types can certainly be said to express themselves and say they're vengeful, moralistic acts of punishment or revenge. But what they avow as their intention is self-deceived, and it's usually a moralistic expression. And because of that, they can be said to be engaged in the self-defeating pattern evaluations. Their acts express a motivation, really express a motivation that they disavow, even to themselves, holding together the deception and the psychic satisfaction from realizing their real intentions more and more difficult. Or, without self-deception, one could say, this is an example for all of the highly educated graduate students in philosophy who end up not being able to find a job, other than in the kind of teaching institution I'm about to cite. So I could say, teaching that course 4 times a week on ethics for bureaucrats is what I did. It's my deed. My intention to teach the course is real. It's expressed in what I do. My preparation, my showing up on time, they all express my intention to do a good job. But this job I found at East Podunk Technical Teachers College is the only one I could find after Princeton. And the activity is not an expression of my highest values, or what I would have chosen, or what I believe ought to be taught. I can be said to see some aspect of myself in the deeds, say, my willingness to do whatever it takes to keep teaching some sort of philosophy. But certainly not the self I would wholeheartedly affirm. Nothing I attribute to Nietzsche is inconsistent with such a characterization, and so I conclude that the account of expressivism I attribute to him is not subject to the kinds of criticisms I've been hearing, like the ones I expressed today and tried to answer. Thank you very much for your patience.